Hello, welcome back to 340 Paddler, and we are on to week 13. We're about halfway through this training program. I'm going to take it up to about week 25, which, if you started around January 1st, will take it right up to the race, or just about right up to the race. And if you start a little earlier, that's perfectly fine. You can always make some adjustments at the end. But we are, of course, trying to get you out on that river, feeling good about yourself, confident in your fitness, and ready to take on the monster, which is the 340. So where do we start? We start where we always do, with cardio. And this should look familiar. You're pretty much getting sick of seeing this, but these are the same cardio goals, the same ones that we've had for a couple of weeks, and will continue through the end of the program. For finisher to 60 hours, week 13, you're doing the exact same thing. You can always change it up. You can decide, hey, instead of running, I'm going to bike or whatever else. Remember, these, as you get on the water, become recovery, not your primary source of cardio. You'll get cardio on the water as well. But you need to keep this foundation because you will lose cardio fitness, and it does take a long time to build back up. You are actually getting more and more fit, even though you might be doing the same 4-mile run and only seeing a difference of a minute or two every time, or sorry, a second or two every time. If you see a difference of a minute or two, that's really impressive. So for those of you looking for sub 50, week 13, you're extending that long run. Your 2 4-milers are the same, but the long run is now to 7 miles. This is going to take you up to that hour or beyond an hour mark. This is where things can start to get tough. Don't get excited and try to go for 10 right away. You're going to run into problems because basically, as you go further and further, your form might break down. Your body's not used to it, so you want to take your time. This is also where hydration becomes an issue, so make sure that you know where you can stop for water, or maybe you're going to carry it with you. I personally never do, but to each their own. I also live in Wisconsin, and most of you are in Missouri, so slight difference in weather. So make sure you're doing that long run. Let's talk about intervals. Nothing big, no big changes here. So same thing, you're looking at 2x20, minute on, minute off as a possibility, your 3x5 minute, your mile repeats. And just a reminder, once you get on water, of course, it changes. Now, these intervals should not go beyond roughly 45 minutes or so. From the time you warm up until you finish should be about 45 minutes. You can even include the warm up in that. The reason is, as you go further and further, you're not going to be able to crank up the tempo as much. You'll be falling off each time, so it's sort of a law of diminishing returns. Plus, anything beyond 45 minutes to an hour, and really you're not getting that much out of it. You're probably losing more in terms of technique than what you're gaining in terms of muscle or fitness. So let's talk about our topic of the week, heart rate. We see a lot of people wearing heart rate monitors, but why? What good does it do us? Well, from an athletic perspective, if you're training these zones, and by the way, the zones change depending on what you're using, but these zones are a good recommendation. So let's take a look at our zones. And these are very, very basic. You will want to figure out your own zones. There are websites where you can do that, putting in your age and other factors, and it will kick out what your heart rate should be at different zones. We've been doing a lot of work here in cardio. Should have been in the endurance to aerobic zone. You don't really want to go above that when you're starting with cardio. You can start getting into this threshold zone. That's probably where you're doing your intervals. So I'll put an I there. That's your intervals. This is your cardio. And I'm assuming you're more or less starting out. You're not a 5-year veteran. If you're very good, and as we get into June, you might want to look at bumping your intervals up to this level, but make sure that your heart is capable of handling it. If you have a cardiologist who's telling you, please don't crank your heart rate up, then please don't do it. This is where things can get dangerous on occasion. So a lot of zone charts don't include this. They want to keep people a little bit lower. So basically, this is cardio, this is interval. By the way, when you're racing, you're probably going to be way down here for the race, because anything higher and you're going to burn yourself out. So you don't want to be up here. I did that one year for 2.5 hours the morning of day 2. Not a good idea. I suffered badly for that as the race continued. So with that in mind, as I said, everyone has slightly different heart rate zones. So here we see Fitbit, Apple Watch, Orange Theory, etc., etc. And they give you some idea of where they're placing it. Sometimes it's 1% different. Sometimes it's 5%. Just something to keep in mind. If you can find a good calculator online to do this, then follow those numbers, ignore whatever you have. So what are the pros of heart rate training? Why run out and get a Fitbit or whatever else? Well, as a beginner, it teaches you about your body's reaction to exercise. So you can start to train your body to work in a certain zone when you're working out. And your body gets used to that, and that becomes sort of a set point. So very useful. It also keeps you from starting too hard. For example, if you're wearing a heart rate monitor on the race, you might look at it and go, wow, my heart rate's at 175. It probably shouldn't be that high 3 hours into the race. It helps you control your intensity and provides feedback on improvement. And we've used heart rate a little bit, especially when we started with that foundation, building things up and trying to keep your heart rate low to avoid overtraining. Now, you should notice as a beginner that your heart rate for different exercises actually drops, and it becomes harder to increase your heart rate for the same exercise. So running, you might start out and you go, wow, I'm running and my heart rate's up near 160. That's really high. That must mean I'm doing really well. Well, sort of. You'll want to bring it down, and your heart rate will naturally come down from that level. So you might be running at 145 average after a few months. Regular exerciser, heart rate helps you control intensity, gives you feedback on improvement. So oftentimes you might be looking for a higher or lower heart rate depending on what you're doing. And also feedback during and after sessions. Are you working hard enough? Or are you working too hard? Because some people will actually work too hard, especially on recovery days. That's where this can become really useful. For someone serious, you can work out at the right intensity, track and adjust your training program, and see your body's reaction to training. So if you get really serious into it, you can watch, for example, your resting heart rate. If it's unusually high one day, you don't work out, because it either means you're still recovering or you're about to get sick. So it can be very useful for that, to avoid some of those headaches. Of course, there are cons as well. So you can become very dependent on it. A lot of people do. They become very obsessed with the numbers. Also, you have to keep in mind your heart rate fluctuates depending on a number of factors. Are you getting enough sleep? Do you have too much caffeine? What's the temperature? What's your altitude? Do you do drugs? If you do, share. Are you stressed? Whatever the situation is, it can actually bump your heart rate up and give you the illusion of working harder, etc. If you wear a heart rate monitor on a regular basis, you will notice this. You'll go on a run and go, wow, that I seem to be 10 beats a minute faster than usual. Well, you think back and you go, well, maybe it was that cup of coffee that I had, whatever it is. Now, the monitors, there's a ton of them. I'm not recommending any particular monitor. I personally use Garmin. But the one thing to keep in mind, the wrist-based monitors are fine if you're out for a run or something like that, something steady state. But they don't work well for intervals in my experience. When you're really trying to crank things up, they're problematic. Instead, I prefer a chest strap monitor. Tends to be more accurate. So it will give me a more accurate number when I'm running steady state, but also when I'm doing intense training. Many of them are wrist-based, and then you can get the chest strap. So like Garmin, I can get a wrist heart rate monitor and then get an aftermarket strap that will talk to the heart rate monitor, and the external strap will always take precedent if I'm wearing it. So something like that may well help. And these, you can buy them used for as little as 50 or 60 bucks, or even an off-brand. They go all the way up to $500-600. I wouldn't recommend spending that kind of money, but that's just me. I tend to be fairly, what's the term? Cheap is the term that I'm looking for. So if you want to get out there, you want to crank down the river as if there's no effort at all. You just keep working out, keeping track of things. And by the way, that heart rate monitor will be useful during the race to keep you in the appropriate zone to get you through the whole thing. Because if you go out too fast and you burn out, that's going to be a problem. But also, if you're not cranking hard enough, that could be a problem. So if you're going to use a heart rate monitor, make sure that you're used to it. You've used it for months before you get to the race. So if you have any questions, comments, concerns, quarrels, qualms, quandaries, curse words, please leave them in the comments below. Otherwise, this is 340 Paddler, hoping that you keep your paddle in the water.